Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this latest breakfast session. We are delighted to have Associate Professor Josephine Paparo with us this morning from Macquarie University. And a huge thank you to Josephine for making the time to get up this morning. And a huge thank you to you all for being there. Really appreciate it. So, Josephine is going to talk to us about from small things, big things grow. Simulation-based education within postgraduate psychology as a case example of how one idea can lead to a burgeoning program of educational leadership. She is a recipient of the 2024, or one of the 2024 AAUT citations for outstanding contribution to student learning. So she's congratulations to you, Josephine, for that. And she's clearly on top of her game. She's one of the leaders in this field in Australia. Otherwise, she would not have been recognised. So congratulations to you. And we're really looking forward to what you've got to say this morning, Josephine.
Thanks so much.
Before I hand over to Josephine, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this session from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, it's the people of the Adelaide Plains, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. I also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands that you're joining us from today, and acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are attending today. So, Josephine, I've made you a co-host. I will stop sharing and I'll hand over to you. So, thanks for being there, Associate Professor Josephine Paparo.
Thanks, Stuart. I'll just share my screen. Bear with me. And I'm sure I need to swap views. There we go. Hopefully that's all coming through. Okay.
Yeah, that's coming through perfectly now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stuart, for the generous and warm introduction this morning, and also for bearing with the mouthful of the title that is the presentation today.
Okay.
Did really well.
Yeah.
And I'm really delighted to be here to share with everyone here today and to hopefully learn from each other as well. Just before we get going, I'd like to extend Stuart's acknowledgement of country to the Wallumattagal people of Darug country, who are the traditional custodians of the very pretty, as you can see, lands that Macquarie University sits on. We're very lucky here at Macquarie. And in particular, I've chosen to showcase this image, which features a sacred spot on our campus called the Learning Circle, and that overlooks our lake and our park gardens there. And it's a sacred space that really acknowledges the significance of this style of sharing, of learning as a way to pass down and hand down knowledge from our Indigenous people, who are really, I guess, the first educators for our nation. And so I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their cultures and customs as having nurtured this land and continuing to nurture this land, always was, always will be. In terms of what I'm hoping to kind of cover today, I did want to start with just a little bit more of an introduction, and then I'll move on to kind of the context for this presentation, which I think is a little bit different to some of the other breakfast learning series talks that may have been done previously. And then move on to sort of discussing as a case example an initiative that I was involved in and chaired, which centered around simulation-based education for psychology. But then from there, really kind of, I guess, expanding onto what I call the spin-off potential, how from one idea, from one initiative, you can really build a program of educational leadership. And then I've got some hopefully hot tips for you for those who might be also grappling with how to kind of start to foster and cultivate a program of educational leadership. But as I said, before I get too far into it, I thought I would just share a little bit more about me. And so my background is actually as a clinical psychologist. So I started by working career, working as a clinician, and then sort of decided to re-enter academia, first as a supervisor for postgraduate psychology students undergoing their training, and then moving on to a more expanded academic role. I'm currently what's called a teaching and leadership job family academic at Macquarie University, which means about 70% of my role is teaching, 30% is sort of service and leadership. And as part of sort of my role at Macquarie, I've served as a course director of one of our postgraduate psychology programs, and that's following my roles at other institutions where I similarly served as the director or coordinator of various aspects of postgraduate psychology training, ranging from an external placements coordinator to a managing director of a training clinic, course director of other programs, and so on. My big passion is training and educating future psychologists, and also looking at ways we can optimise education and training, in particular for psychology. But I'd really like to use this as an opportunity to get to know more about you and just get a sense of who we've got with us today. And so I have got a couple polls prepared, and Stuart's going to very kindly launch the first poll for me. I just would really love to get a sense of your current role in terms of whether you identify as a teaching intensive or research intensive academic, whether you see yourself as more in a balanced academic role, or indeed if you're in any other type of role.
Hi, Josephine. So I put both of the polls in the one there, so you're
No,
going to get
that's fine. We'll
all of
work
those.
with that. Thank you so much, Stuart. I'll just give people a couple seconds to kind of
No
answer
problem.
that. So you're
You can
probably
see, can you see the live results?
yes, I can.
Okay, great.
Thank you. And you can probably see there on the screen the second poll, which is just how long you've been in academia. Thanks again, Stuart, for preparing those. Okay. So give it another second, but otherwise I'll end that poll. I think we've got pretty much most people there, and I'll just share the results so everyone can see that. Hopefully you're able to see those. Are they coming through on the screen there, Stuart?
Yep, that definitely are for me.
Excellent. And so I guess, unsurprisingly, given the topic of our talk today and the nature of the talk, a majority of people here are identifying as teaching intensive. So hopefully a lot of what we're discussing will have great relevance for you today. And in terms of kind of experience in academia, it's amazing to see such wealth of experience and seeing a lot of people who've been around for a while.
Yeah.
And also some people who are relative newbies into the profession. So thank you so much for sharing. That helps me to sort of understand you today.
Okay, I'll minimize it now, okay?
Wonderful, thank you. So a little bit of context then for the talk. Why have I decided to present this particular topic? So when I was first approached and asked to give this talk, I did look at some very inspirational prior projects and talks from the previous years, and really people talking about some amazing projects that they had facilitated. And then when I went to put my own pen to paper, I started to reflect on the fact that my journey in academia and educational leadership really did begin from one project, but currently is an amalgam of a number of other endeavours from which that initial project was a springboard. I also thought about this in terms of our current higher education sector and seeing that we've really had an influx in recent years of the teaching focused or education focused academic. And really that those roles have really just kind of, it seems to have been almost like an exponential increase. Particularly seeing a lot of young academics, and I don't mean in chronological age, I mean in terms of entering academia young, taking up these roles. And something that I've observed in my own context is that a lot of these early career academics in these teaching intensive roles tend to get very bogged down by the all-consuming nature of teaching delivery. And yeah, that's important, right? If I think about our Macquarie University own mission statement, it's really around serving and engaging students through transformative learning experiences. And so we do that through our teaching. We do that through our course delivery and curriculum design. But also, I guess what I was saying is that in becoming very bogged down with the teaching delivery side of things, that for a lot of academics, that they were really struggling to really understand how they might be able to maintain and extend that teaching to a dual focus on progressing their educational leadership. And for me personally, I see that as a huge concern, because we then risk the cultivation of an environment where we are disconnected from the broader educational context in which we are practicing. And so what I thought I would do today, after contacting Stuart and seeing that this seemed like an okay idea, was to present one of the ideas that did go into that AAUT application for a citation, but also to talk about how that really launched a range of other initiatives that I've since become involved in, and how in doing so we can really build and cultivate a multifaceted portfolio of educational leadership. And so I do want to add some caveats here, and that's obviously things that I'm not an expert. This is really just sharing of, I guess, musings from my own learnings and I guess lived experience being in education focused roles for my entire academic career. But I do want to recognise that wealth of experience that we obviously have in the group today as per the poll, and hoping that there'll be some opportunities for you to also share what some of your experiences have been. In terms of sharing today, don't be shy to raise your hand and to speak to the group. And obviously, as Stuart said, we've got a Q&A, and there's also the chat feature, which I believe is enabled. And I guess first off, I just kind of want to start with a bit of an understanding of, what are some of the challenges that people have found in cultivating a program of educational leadership, whether as a teaching-focused academic or otherwise. Feel free to raise your hand or otherwise pop that into the chat. And my intention here is to kind of clock some of these challenges and hopefully make sure that I can perhaps speak to some of them today. Anyone willing to sort of put out there? I know one of the things that often early career academics are coming to me and saying is, I just don't know how to fit it all in. I just don't have the time. Is that something that resonates with others? Thanks, Svetlana. It sounds like that definitely resonated with you, and a couple others are sort of saying that as well. And thank you. There's some comments there around maintaining discipline, relevance and expertise as a teaching academic. Absolutely. So how do I kind of maintain, I guess, that focus on sort of my discipline, but also be thinking about this within that broader context of higher education landscape? I'm not sure if that's what you meant there, Isabella, but certainly that's what came to mind when I read your comment there. So clearly there are a few things that we are seeing as challenges to being able to cultivate a program of educational leadership. And I hope that some of the things that I'll be reflecting on today will attend to that. And Elizabeth has also just commented there around getting past the sense of novice and isolation. Absolutely. You'll hear me talk a little bit later also about imposterism. And how kind of being able to kind of overcome that is huge, as well as we'll talk a lot about harnessing collaboration and building connections with people. So hopefully that helps. And we've got several other comments coming through now. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the sharing of your thoughts there around absolutely things like institutional support and being able to feel that that's kind of enabling us to kind of build these kind of profiles. And that collaborative support, that's a really interesting reflection there, Ram. Thanks for sharing that, there are a lot of academics there who don't feel that, we need to kind of expand beyond, I guess, our siloed or myopic little area of the world, and how do we kind of get beyond that? And I would agree that I think sometimes that's a reflection of a lack of familiarity between academics. I'll talk a little bit today about how you can generate kind of partnerships. Sometimes what feels like out of thin air. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so I guess what I wanted to do front up is just to present as a case example an initiative that I was involved in as chair which looked at simulation-based education for psychology, just to provide a little bit of an example of running a program of educational leadership. And then later I'll talk to kind of a spin-off that's come from that. But my key take home from this part of the presentation is the power of collaboration. And hopefully you'll see that as I talk about this a little bit further. And in that same vein, I would really like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the amazing colleagues, many of whom actually I didn't know, in fact, none of whom I knew before we took on this enterprise together. And it was just such a pleasure working with these colleague psychology trainers. So in terms of the initiative, which was the group that I founded and chaired, which is the Australian Postgraduate Psychology Education Simulation Working Group, another mouthful, so we call it APASWIG for short. But essentially there were 19 of us across around 15 institutions right around Australia. And I do have a lot to pay in gratitude to my colleagues listed on the page here. I added this in yesterday. I wasn't going to include this as part of my presentation, but I was slightly inspired by the fact that I've spent the last couple of weeks providing feedback as an application mentor for a range of different educational leadership awards that are floating around at the moment. And one of the things I found myself repeating in my feedback over and over was the importance of the narrative and telling the story of an initiative that one is engaged in. What I've popped up here is the STAR method, which is one method for doing so that actually comes from interviewing techniques. And if this is something that is new to you, that you're not familiar with this, I would recommend making this your new best friend. And I'll try and discuss the initiative with this concept of the STAR method in mind today, where we kind of discuss what the situation was, the actions we took, the task at hand, the actions we took, and the results that came from that. But first, a little bit of background to the initiative. So this was really spawned out of the immense impact that we all know the COVID-19 pandemic had on education across the board. But for us in our little domain, looking at postgraduate psychology training. And so at the time when we were all in kind of that initial panic, back in that early pandemic period, my boss at the time, who is a change maker herself, Professor Catherine Nicholson-Perry, while we were at the Australian College of Applied Psychology, now called ACAP University College, decided to band together all the psychology trainers and leaders from around the country. So we met over Teams before people were even using Teams or Zoom really for these kind of purposes. And we thought, you know, we're all having the same issues and problems. Let's get together and try and find a consensus solution. And there was one particular meeting that Catherine unfortunately couldn't attend, and I was attending as the course director and clinic director involved in the Master of Clinical Psychology at that time. And so she asked whether I would be willing to step in and chair that meeting. And my first response was, oh, goodness, I can't do that, but decided to take the bull by the horns and went off and we had the meeting. And one of the real key challenges that came up in that particular meeting was a discussion around the immense impact that the pandemic was having on the disruption to practicum training, which is a critical component of postgraduate psychology training. And so what we were seeing was that a range of impacts from substantial delay through to the cessation or cancellation of placements. And this was really leading to a backlog of students for training. Not ideal at a time when mental health need in our community was at its highest. So that was, you know, placing a lot more pressure on those who were still finding ways to practice. And as someone who at the time was also actively practicing, I can say that, you know, my books, you know, got closed very quickly, and there was this real pressure on those who were practicing to really try and take on this backlog of clients who were desperate for psychological services, but we had this training pipeline that had really come to a halt because of the disruption to practicum. And so one of the solutions posed at that meeting was, why don't we leverage the opportunities afforded by simulation-based education, which sounds simple and enough. And so just a little bit of background for those who don't know about simulation-based education and training or haven't had a lot of experience with it. It's something that's used very often in the context of health professional training to provide authentic training experiences that really balance the acquisition of those professional practice competencies, while at the same time ensuring that there are adequate protections for public safety. And when we're talking about simulation, we're really thinking about a technique that creates an environment or a situation that allows a person to experience a representation of a real event, so a real practice event, for example, for the purposes of training, evaluation, and testing. And there has been a wealth of evidence across other allied health and medical fields showing how effective simulation can be in training professionals. And this has really led to the systematic and successful integration of simulation-based education and learning in training programs for areas like medicine, nursing, psychiatry, and allied health. And ultimately, we know that there are a lot of benefits from that work to this simulation-based training approach. I always think of this quote from Confucius. So even though he was well before our time of simulation-based education and training, I feel like the quote I've popped up there really does highlight what the benefits of simulation can be. But beyond that, what we really see is bridging the gap between theory and practice, but doing so in a way that supports a very safe learning experience, both for clients in the future, but also the student to feel really scaffolded and to learn in a very hands-on way without the stress and the pressure of potentially harming a real person. It also enables curriculum control. It builds an element of consistency in training experiences, which we can't guarantee when we send a student out on placement. Placements can be very variable. It also supports sustainability. While there's an initial kind of investment in resourcing to set up simulation, once developed, these activities can be repeated over time. In addition, it helps us to develop what are called appropriate illness scripts. So often when we send students off into a placement, because we can't control the experiences that they are confronted with there, sometimes they encounter what really are atypical client presentations, and that starts to form the basis or their heuristic for what it's like to treat a client with that presentation. Whereas with a simulation, we can actually create typical client scripts. But beyond that, we find that simulation really comes into its own for teaching these so-called halo or high acuity, low occurrence events. So events that are high risk, but actually occur in very low frequency out there in the field. And so by very definition, when a student goes out on placement, while we want them to know how to handle these situations, they might not actually get experience doing so. And I guess finally, as a way to really encourage student engagement and support positive student outcomes, there's a lot of research in the various fields showing the benefits of simulation. Despite this, the acceptance and integration of simulated learning activities for the purposes of accruing graduate competencies in the Australian professional psychology context has been much slower than for the other health professions. And there are many reasons why this has been proposed as to being the case. One is the financial and workload issues associated with implementation of simulation, and this is undeniable, but I sort of think, yeah, others, though, have managed to find ways around this. So this can't really account for it all. A big factor seems to be that in psychology, our accreditation standards don't currently uniformly recognise the value of simulated learning activities within placement experiences across programs. We have various levels of psychology training programs at the professional level, and simulation is only really recognised for placement upskilling in some programs and not others. Further, despite ample evidence supporting its use in the Australian context among psychology trainees and trainers, there seem to exist a lot of misgivings about the use of simulated learning in psychology. And really where that seemed to come from was a lack of clarity and a standardised approach for guiding how and when simulation could appropriately and ethically be utilised to optimise psychology education and training. And that's where APA came into it. We thought, this is something that we might be able to do something about, to develop some sort of framework that might help with this. And so going back to, I guess, that STAR method, the situation we were in was really a problem of the recognition and uptake of simulated learning activities in psychology, which were acting as a barrier to our proposed solution for dealing with the placement crisis at the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what was the proposal? So we're in this meeting, we're having this discussion, and people are going, yeah, but people don't like simulation. They don't know how to do simulation. And I sort of, in that moment, I was like, oh, maybe we could develop a working group, go off and maybe look at this. And I remember at the time, having that wrong way go back mental image going, oh, you can't do this, and that imposterism coming in. But nonetheless, we proposed this, and I was amazed at the incredible uptake from my colleagues. And so, as I said, 19 of us got together from across 15 institutions with the objective of developing these best practice guidelines for integrating simulated learning activities in Australian postgraduate psychology training. This was not only to potentially provide a strong rationale for necessary variations to work integrated learning during COVID-19, but also just in general to kind of boost the uptake of quality best practice simulation. And I see we've got a hand raised there. Pearl. Pearl, was there something you wanted to add there? Certainly, if there was something you wanted to say and you're having any tech issues, feel free to kind of just pop it in the chat there. But just to sort of reflect on, this was not without challenge. For anyone who knows the psychology education and psychology field, it's certainly a discipline that's fraught with a lot of complexities and a lot of what we would say politicization and division. So in our group, we had people who identified as what are called clinical psychologists, professional psychologists, counselling psychologists, health psychologists. So have really no small feat to kind of bring everyone together to come up with a consensus solution and set of guidelines. We also had a range of institutions from sort of the private college where I was at, but also right up to Sandstone and a group of 8 institutions, and also different profiles of trainers from your sort of part-time, early career psychology educators through to current and former heads of schools of psychology and departments from across the country. So, and I'm so incredibly proud of the collegiality that this group demonstrated in coming together. Stuart, was there something you wanted to add there?
Hi, Josephine. No, it was just a reminder for people to post questions in the Q&A window. That's all.
Oh, amazing. No, thank you,
But I
Stuart.
put it in the chat, so we're good to go. Sorry, Josephine.
And so how did we go about doing this? So the first thing we did is held meetings to define the scope of the project. And I highly recommend that for anyone looking to do any similar initiatives, to define your scope at the start. Otherwise, it can become bigger than Ben-Hur. And then to really develop a consensus approach and strategy that included our dissemination plan. We then consulted the literature and pre-existing best practice standards because they did exist, particularly in the field of nursing and other more medical professions. There was a lot of guidelines and frameworks that have been developed in those contexts around how to go about engaging in simulation. We just didn't have the equivalent translated for psychology. We then mapped out what our guidelines, framework or document should look like. And then from there, we went about delegating subgroups from our 19 people involved to address different sections of that document and identified subgroup leads who could keep those sections on track. In addition, we had regular full group meetings to check in and track that progress. And this was really to also ensure any emerging developments were taken into account, to keep people motivated and engaged, and really just make sure we had some consensus around what we were developing, as well as incorporating some troubleshooting that came up along the way. And I've added there just a little note that as the chair of the group, I would also routinely reach out to the subgroup leads just to check in on how things were going. If I'd sort of identified any potential risks of social loafing, which can sometimes happen in these kind of groups, I'd sort of reach out and check with the individual if they were still wanting to be engaged and involved. And that's sort of how we kept things progressing. We then, once we had our guidelines, assembled an independent external review panel. And so I'm very grateful to Gregory Buck from Carn Miller, Kristen Murray from ANU, and Emma Quigley from ECU, who served as our external panel, who kind of looked at our guidelines. We'd been in this parochial kind of task for the last year. And so we wanted some people outside of us to sort of go, oh, are we on the right track? Is there anything we've missed? And then finally, we executed our dissemination plan, which included direct dissemination of the guidelines, publication of the guidelines, and a conference presentation, as well as later a presentation to our external regulators. And so what did our guidelines include? So ultimately, we proposed 9 criteria for the incorporation of simulated learning activities in professional training. And I'll just pop them up in the screen without going into them in too much detail, because some of them are very specific to psychology, and you can certainly read our guidelines document or publication if you would like to know more about that. But really what it offered us was a criteria from which we could say to our colleagues in the profession, hey, if you're running simulations, here's some ideas for how you might go about doing this in a way that is aligning with best practice. In addition to that, we thought about what the ethical considerations might be. We presented that. We also looked at any issues there might be with implementation and made sure to cover those. And we also covered what could be future directions for our profession, including things that might mitigate some of those issues with implementation. So collaborating across institutions and interprofessionally around building, for example, banks of simulated learning activities to reduce that resource burden. And then, of course, also that engagement with our external regulators to kind of boost an argument for equal recognition of simulation in psychology. So what were the results or the outcomes? So we have our guidelines document, which was published under a Creative Commons license, and then the publication that also rose from that. And we were so delighted to see an incredibly wide readership that publication received, and I've included some of the metrics on the side of the screen there. But beyond that, we saw that some of our colleagues outside of the group were taking note. And so in particular, a group from the University of New England, so Kylie Rice and colleagues, basically took our guidelines and extended them to develop guidelines for actually developing a simulated placement, which was amazing because that was kind of where we started in our journey. And then they've gone on and sort of provided an evaluation of that. So a huge acknowledgement there to Kylie Rice and co for the amazing work they've done in taking the guidelines and expanding it further. And I definitely had, some communications from other psychology trainers nationally who were talking about how they'd, undertaken projects in their own context that really expanded the guidelines as well. And in terms of our engagement of our external accreditor and regulator, we got some really lovely feedback from them that the guidelines also had applications that they could see beyond what we had originally kind of developed them for, but also to providing, for example, rural and remote students studying online with the opportunity to access quality simulated learning. And so what really we thought was kind of a drop in the ocean that we were starting with had all these reverberations that we hadn't considered. But sort of going on from that, what I really wanted to talk about was how from this one idea, I was able to kind of expand it into a program of educational leadership. So my key take-home message from this particular part of the presentation is leveraging different opportunities and partnerships and how important that is in cultivating a multifaceted educational portfolio. And what I'm really talking about here is spin-off potential, that from such a small initiative originally, as big things grew. So where did this kind of go? Well, I mean, I guess for me personally, there's some of the awards that have come out of, presenting this initiative that wasn't even really on my radar that this was something that would come out of all this, but, that's nice. But more important from that were the opportunities to engage with other colleagues. So I started off with AppsWeek, and then while I was working with the subgroup I had been assigned to and was leading, one of my colleagues said, hey, I actually think that there's a qualitative paper that we could all work on together. And so we did that. We gained training perceptions of simulated learning. Then after AppsWeek, one of our colleagues said, we really need a research arm to actually look at ways to start to test the quality of simulation. And currently I'm a part of a group called the Simulation-Based Education and Research Initiative. and we're looking at ways to operationalise our guidelines. I also was asked by APAC to speak with them about, okay, how could we expand simulation? And then later on in a podcast about the future of psychology training and simulation. Again, things I never envisaged would be a part of this project from the beginning. And then sort of took the guidelines, applied it locally in a project at Macquarie University, and was able to present that at a symposium, which was well received by my colleagues here. And then I had a colleague who was part of the group that decided that they wanted to run a really important project that didn't even relate to simulation. It was like, hey, do you want to be a part of it? And brought together a bunch of other colleagues, and we did that. And then one of the colleagues from that group then decided that they wanted to do another project. And so we all kind of jumped onto that as well. And then most recently, one of my Upper Suite colleagues reached out to me last year and said, hey, why don't we do a peer-arranged learning session at the ANZAPI conference? So ANZAPI is the Australian New Zealand Association of Health Professional Educators. That was in Adelaide last year. So we did. And while I was there, I did a site visit of the University of Adelaide and health simulation hub that they have there, which is amazing. If you get a chance to go, I encourage you to go. But met some really inspiring people there who we've now collaborated with on a book chapter for teaching health psychology using working with simulated patients. And then beyond that, while at the ANZAPI conference and in this peer-arranged learning session, what we actually did is we popped up just a simple QR code at the end of the presentation. We said, hey, if there's anyone out there that's interested in collaborating, please reach out to us. We'd really love to work with you. And so now at the moment, I'm chairing a separate collaboration, which is looking at health professional educator wellbeing. And so really my point here is that from this really small initial initiative, so many things seem to grow out of that. And that's something that I really wanted to highlight today, the importance of leveraging partnerships and opportunities, particularly that some of those comments that people were saying at the start, I don't have time, I don't know if I'm going to have support, how do I bring colleagues into this? And I think it's really about squeezing out of any of these partnerships that you develop everything that you can. And so that brings me to my 10 hot tips. And I'm sure many of you also have your own tips. So please don't hesitate to pop them in the chat to share with everyone today as I go through my own tips. I'm a big believer in learning from, but also with one another. And so I'd love to see what some of the things that you have to say are, things that you've learned along the way, given the great expertise in our audience. But my first tip, I guess, is really identifying an area of need, picking a niche, being able to go, oh, we've got this problem at the moment and we need a solution, even if it feels really big at the time. Be a big blue sky thinker. And then you can kind of drill it back and define the scope from there. But I guess that's really the first step of any initiative. Then looking for those opportunities for partnership. I had a colleague recently ask me, how do you go about generating these different initiatives, Jo, and working with these different people? As I said, at the Suite, I didn't know any of my collaborators before we kind of started that project. But similarly, the collaborators on the Health Professional Educator Wellbeing initiative I'm on at the moment, likewise, didn't know anyone other than my collaborator from Upper Suite. And it was just simply a QR code put up at a conference. And I had this colleague is literally, as I'm presenting today, at an international conference. And I said to her, why don't you at the end of your presentation similarly pop up a QR code? What's the worst that could happen? And her comment was, no one responds to it. I'm like, yes, I get that. And that would feel like, that little bit of an ouchie that no one's interested in working with us. But actually, from my perspective, the worst thing that could happen is you've got like 20 or 30 people who register interest, and you're like, oh goodness, how am I going to go about this? But really just trying to look for those opportunities. As I've already spoken about today, the importance of harnessing the power of collaboration. And this is not just within our institutions, this is also beyond our institutions. Most of the collaborations that I've worked on are really, that I've spoken about at least today, have been with collaborators outside of my immediate microcosm. And that's been so incredibly helpful, but also outside of my profession. So currently working with health professional educators from occupational therapy, physiotherapy, medicine, a whole range of different practitioners. And as part of this, delegate, delegate, delegate. So I had another colleague say to me, but I don't know how to do some of these things. I don't know how to do certain projects or every part of a project. I'm like, that's the beauty of working in a team when you're collaborating. It's leveraging the expertise in your group and finding people who do. I've certainly done that very recently with the health professional educator collaboration I'm involved in. We're doing a scoping review. I've never run a scoping review before, but I have people in my team who have. It's also helpful to remember that you don't have to run everything all the time. I spoke about in my mind map from Aberystwyth how while I was leading that initiative, I had a colleague from that initiative who wanted to run a benchmarking study around practicums. And then from that particular initiative, one of our colleagues decided they wanted to lead a project looking at problems of professional competency in psychology students. So you don't have to be the leader all the time. And also you don't have to do everything yourself, being my key tip there. Importantly, establishing goodwill. That's how these partnerships develop. Building goodwill amongst your colleagues, and then being able to call on them down the track to say, hey, would you like to collaborate? Or hey, could you help me out with this? Really, really important. Tip 6, finding mentors and sponsors. So a mentor being someone who provides guidance and advice, while a sponsor being someone who advocates for and champions your career advancement, often using their own influence and connection to open doors and provide opportunities. So that's something that I've had the great benefit. I feel very lucky to have had a number of amazing mentors and sponsors in my time, including someone that I hadn't met before, but became involved in the Aberystwyth initiative, Professor Anna Johansson down at University of Adelaide, who's been an amazing mentor and sponsor for me. And so I have a lot of credit that I'd like to give Anna for her advice over the years of how to basically expand my program of educational leadership and encourage you to find your own mentors and sponsors in the same way. Build, build, build. I've already sort of spoken about this, but this idea of squeezing out of opportunities all that you can and looking for that spin-off potential. Integrating what you're doing with teaching practice. I spoke about how I took the Aberystwyth project and I applied it at a local level with a unit I was running in postgraduate psychology at Macquarie University. And that's really important, as well as balancing all this with teaching mission. We do need to remember core business, and that often is teaching delivery, but really thinking about ways that I can balance this by expanding into that broader educational context. So I can stay, I guess, on top of where this is all coming from, what I'm doing on a local level, how it fits into the landscape. And I know that for a lot of people, the idea of adding things on top of their teaching load can be very daunting. Definitely start small and be selective and strategic with what you're doing when. But one thing I'll say is that while it might seem paradoxical to say to do more, I know that I am most energized in my teaching when I'm involved in these initiatives outside of kind of my direct teaching delivery that then informs my teaching delivery. And so I get very inspired by it. And it's something that, we're looking at in that health professional educator project at the moment, how often educators can lose interest and passion when they're sort of bogged down in teaching delivery. And so this is really an opportunity to diversify your portfolio and in the same way contribute to your sustainability in education focus roles. And finally, be brave. As I said at the start, when I talked about first proposing Aberystwyth, I felt a lot of imposterism in doing so. I was very early career academic at the time. So it felt quite bolshy for me to kind of be like, hey, let's do this. But I'm so glad that I worked past that. And I encourage you all to be brave, to think about the opportunities that are before you, and to really kind of throw yourself out there, perhaps move a little bit out of your comfort zone into your challenge zone, and really have that opportunity to see where things can grow. And so from that, I have a little bit of homework for everyone. Not really homework, it's more a challenge for you. And that challenge is, even from today, to start thinking about any opportunities you might have to engage colleagues or collaborate with colleagues, even if it's just identifying potentially a mentor or a sponsor that you can reach out to and strengthen your connection with at whatever stage of the journey you're at. I recently did this myself and reached out to someone at my institution who's involved in the execution of our education portfolio centrally. Just like, hey, would you like to grab a coffee? And it was just an amazing, inspiring chat that we had, from which some other opportunities are growing. And so that's pretty much all I had for you today. I'm hoping that I've at least planted some seeds for people who might be thinking about how they might do this in their own environment. I'd love your feedback. I've popped a QR code. If you do have any feedback you'd like to provide anonymously, or otherwise, feel free to reach out to me directly. But thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Josephine. That was really interesting. And as a teaching academic myself, that resonated on a number of levels, particularly around the time aspect. And I really liked your 10 hot tips. I think I might ask future presenters to come up with 10 hot tips as well, because that's a brilliant takeaway. So thank you very much for that. And really considered, really interesting and fascinating. Lots to think about. So there are a few questions. So what I'll do is I'll ask the people who've posted those questions to ask you the questions directly, if you don't mind. And if you're not here, then if they're not here, then I'll just ask the question.
I'm
So,
just going to pop up the slide again. Some people have asked QR code. I whipped through a little quickly, so if that's okay.
okay, no problem. Okay, so we'll ask the first question. I see that you're there, Elizabeth. If you could, you have a question? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, the question I put in the Q&A was when you were talking about the initial difficulties, I just saw an irony in the reluctance of psychology to use simulation for education in psychology, while so many psychology experiments actually use simulation in order to explore psychological concepts. So I was just wondering, I mean, I saw the paradox or the irony, but did that get mentioned during your design? Did anybody see the connection between psychology experiments and simulation?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I did see your comment when you put that in the chat, but was powering on through. So thank you for reiterating it. And you're absolutely right. What was the consensus was really, simulation wasn't new to psychology. It was something that all of us were using. And indeed, even in our teaching, a role play is a simulation, and we get students to role play all the time. Where we were finding the struggle was the uptake of a systematic program of simulation, and one that could be used in part to offset the required practicum hours for training. Where people seemed to draw the line was, oh no, we can't take away hours from seeing real clients, but not really understanding the principle behind simulation-based education and training. And that's actually that it's a scaffolded journey. So the idea that simulation can be a great first step, or alternatively, a complement to real life client experiences, definitely not taking away client experiences, but a complement to it for those, for example, halo events that I spoke about, those high acuity but low occurrence events. That a student on placement might not get exposure to. So what, we just let them go out in the field and wish them well when they do eventually maybe confront that issue? Or do we have an opportunity to upskill them here in training in a supported environment? So it was really that recognition and acceptance of the simulation as a credible pathway to accruing client experiences, rather than just kind of your basic role playing to start to develop some of those skills, or as you say, in other aspects of psychology. Does that answer your question?
That's great. Thank you. And I did put a note in the chat that there is a congress entirely on simulation in education in Adelaide in August. I've put the link in the chat.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
I would really love to see you there, because I think what you're doing is sort of starting to bring psychology into a field that's actually very broad and well developed, but finds it's often hard to work across disciplines. So it's going to be a very cross-disciplinary opportunity.
So thank you so much for
Yeah,
sharing. I'm going to stop the share just so I can see you a little bit better. Thank you so much. That's wonderful, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Ram Singh Jr. Ram, are you there? Okay.
Yes,
Oh, yes, there you are.
Sorry.
Please, you might want to. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Ram.
Thank you, Stuart. Just a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to clarify something. So I work, I don't work on the teaching academia side. I'm more on the student support side, and I work mostly with the student leadership and how we prepare them for academia later on. Like one of our programs is the PASS program, where we train
Yep.
students for, yeah. And so we notice that a lot of our students do end up in academia as either teaching assistants and later on lecturing. So I noticed that you mentioned that there is a peer-arranged learning session that works with is that something to do with students, or is it something that to do with academia itself?
Apologies for not providing more context for that, but I do have some comments on what you're saying, Ram, which I'll say in a moment. Just to clarify, that's actually an initiative run at the ANZAPI conference, where educators can put in, instead of just doing a standard conference presentation, you can run a peer-arranged learning session. So it is typically for educators, though definitely students across health professions also attend ANZAPI, and we have a great contingent of students who attend that conference. And in fact, one of the people we've brought onto our health professional educator wellbeing collaboration is a student from medicine in Adelaide. That is basically our student rep on that group that we met through that conference as well. So that's basically a fancy way of saying like workshops that are run at conferences. But I think the point you raise, it's something that really speaks to me about sort of upskilling and training and preparing early career, I guess, students to that transition to being then an educator, practitioner. And it's something we're thinking a lot about at Macquarie as well. And certainly the conversations I'm having here is that, we've got this big influx of these education-focused, teaching-intensive roles in the market, but not a lot of guidance exists for how to support that transition from a student who possibly is coming off the back of a PhD, so being in a research-oriented role for a while, or perhaps a postdoc, again, a research-oriented role, and is now transitioning to be an educator in a greater capacity, and really needing to look at, well, how can we build knowledge and awareness of how to actually cultivate that multifaceted portfolio? What are some of the basics so that, we avoid that fate of people just getting bogged down in kind of teaching delivery for 10, 15 years and then going, I really missed out on what chances there to be a part of something bigger.
Yeah. Excellent answer. Thank you. Are we ready to move on? Are you good, Ram?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for the.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. We have Sandra Barker from UniSA. You there, Sandy? Hello.
Yeah, I'm here, Stuart. You know I'm here. Thanks so much for that presentation, Josephine. That was fantastic. I've been involved with simulations in business for a long time now. Just wondering if you think any of your guidelines that you've developed for psychology have a crossover for other disciplines.
Absolutely. And Sandra, thank you for asking that, because that's where we started. I mean, we took guidelines from nursing, for example, and applied them to simulation in psychology. What we found is that there's incredible overlap with the, I guess, in terms of education. So things like competency-based, simulation should be about cultivating some sort of competencies. It should be about new learning. We don't do simulations to teach, things that you already know. We want to scaffold, provide you a safe environment in which to launch your skills. I think, there are many others from those 9 principles there, which, as I said in our publication, if you're interested, that have great transferability across disciplines simply because we're educators, and education, I think, is our core umbrella discipline, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So I think we have a last question from Negusi. Sorry, if I have butchered that name. Please go ahead and ask the question.
He said it correctly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Josephine, for the nice presentation. I have two questions. One is you mentioned one of the challenges is the cost related with the simulation. So if you can roughly, would you tell us the major costs related to this simulation? That is one question. The other one, humbly, if you can, would you share your PPT to us, if you can? These are my questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very happy to. I think Norotam also asked about the slides. I'm
Yeah.
happy to forward them to Stuart if that's useful. And then Stuart, if you've got a
Yeah.
list.
Later on, I'll be sending out a recording of the session to everybody. But Josephine, if you wouldn't mind just making them into a PDF, and I'll attach the PDF to the
Very,
same
very
thing.
much
So
that.
thank you very much.
Just to answer your question, I mean, there are a lot of costs with the initial setup of simulation. So it also comes down to the kind of simulation that you're using, the modality. So, for example, in our area of psychology, we often use simulated patients. Where we acquire those simulated patients from, best practice is to use actors. So you need to think about where you recruit those actors from. Are they paid actors? One of the initiatives one of my colleagues has come up with is using the performing arts media degree at the university to get interns to volunteer their time, or approaching NIDA. I've had someone who also approached NIDA, the National Performing Arts Institute, to ways to offset those costs. So I think ultimately there's always going to be costs depending on the setting you're in. I mean, if you're in a medical field, you need the devices, you need the apparatus, and all those things as well. But I guess my point is that this is about problem solving. Where whatever the costs are, there's always going to be a way to troubleshoot. And if you collaborate across institutions, you share the costs. A problem shared is a problem halved. And that's one of my strong recommendations is looking at ways you can, I guess, share resourcing. Firstly, problem solve. How can I do this as on the cheap as I can resource wise? But also, how can I share the load? And ultimately, what a lot of the research shows is for anyone who's reporting on simulation initiatives, they all point out the costs and the resource intensive nature of it. But the comment usually in the discussion section of the paper at the end is, but it's worth it. And I think that's the final message I'd like to leave with that, is that it's worth it. And I know one of our colleagues who's an OT has written in the chat as well their experiences using simulation for clinical reasoning. And I'm sure that's something you'd agree with, that it's a lot of an investment, but one that's worthy of that time and energy.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I think that's the end of the questions. And just before we say goodbyes, Sandy, my colleague from UniSA, there's a message there for you. I hope you see it from Monica. Wants to reach out she's from the business school at CQU. So again, the breakfast session's making connections, and that's really what we hope to do here.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Stuart.
No worries. So if you could put your hands together virtually for Josephine Paparo, Associate Professor Josephine Paparo, AUTC citation winner, and I'm sure that won't be the last of the accolades that she receives. That was a fantastic presentation, really interesting. And we thank you so much for giving up your time this morning, Josephine. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Stuart, and also for your organisation, and to everyone attending today. It's been a pleasure.
No worries. Thank you, and have a great day, everybody. We'll send out the link and the slides later today or first thing tomorrow morning, but you'll get them soon. So thanks very much for being there, and have a fantastic day.